Thank you to the new Zoom thing that alerts you to the fact that meeting is being recorded by some voiceover from the 50s. Hello, this is Cardstock. Hello, Cardstock. And today we are talking to Vaughn about his IDK cards. Hello, Vaughn. Who are you?
I am currently in the middle of nowhere in France, but my day job is I'm a strategy and entrepreneurship professor at UCL. And the cards, the IDK cards that John just mentioned, they come out of the research that I do for my day job, but then it kind of took a turn in the more practical direction. And I'm hoping to talk about that today. Well, John, how should we do this? I can say a bit more about where all this came from because it all kind of dovetails, or we can take it in whatever direction you think makes the most sense to take it.
Yeah,
so
well, let's start there. Where did this all come from, Vaughn?
Where did this all come from? So I'm trained as an organizational sociologist, right? So what I am most interested in is how you design organizations so that they do interesting and valuable things. And the specific kind of interesting and valuable thing that I'm interested in is how you design organizations so that they're better able to innovate, come up with new ideas that people want to pay money for. And not just new products, but also new services, new ways of doing, new processes. And I spent 10 years doing ethnography. So John mentioned a book that came out last year. It's called The Uncertainty Mindset. And it captures 10 years worth of research into R&D kitchens at some of the best restaurants and culinary innovation teams in the world to look at how they organize themselves to come up with new ideas and then extract some learnings from them that apply not only to culinary R&D, but also much more broadly. So I used to work at Google, I used to work in technology development, and I saw many of the same patterns and the same behaviors and the same organizational design principles in very successful tech innovation teams, as I did in very successful culinary innovation teams. And so what was emerging out of this field work, I was doing ethnographies, spending time embedded with these teams as they did their work and came up with new ideas. What was coming out of this research was this idea that there are different ways of thinking about how you organize teams. And the ways that seem to be better at creating teams that are good at adapting, at innovating, tend to be the ones where the teams are built around the idea that they don't know what the future will be, right? So they've got what I call an uncertainty mindset. They're not saying, here is a risk situation where I know how to optimize what I do for some kind of desired outcome. Instead, what they're saying is, we actually don't know what the outcome could be. We're going to do things differently so that we figure out what we want and how we get there, right? So it's inherently something where you don't know what the future will be. And that main idea, simply admitting that you don't know what the future will be, changes everything. It changes who you hire and how you hire. It changes how you set goals for your people and your team. It also changes how you motivate them to do the work that they're trying to do. Because if you think about it, every one of those three really important things for any team depend on whether you assume you know what the team is going to do, or if you assume that you don't know yet. And if you're trying to create a team that's coming up with new ideas, new products, new services, by definition, you don't know what success looks like until you've gotten there. And much of success is about interpreting something that has happened as being potentially successful, right? So if you use an example that everybody knows, it's hackneyed by now. If you came to someone maybe 15 or 20 years ago and you said, would you like a device that has a big screen on it, but fits in your hand, that will function as a phone and let you do all sorts of other things like, I don't know, book calendar appointment with your doctor. At that time, people did not have the imagination to believe that this could be successful. And part of innovation is not only doing the thing that is innovative, but also coming up with an interpretation of the world in which that thing is a success. And all of these things are super hard. And the thing which I realized in doing that research is that the people and the teams who were really good at doing that were not only people and teams that had this idea that the future was not risky, but uncertain. And I can talk more about that in a little bit. They were actually doing things every day to make themselves more comfortable with a situation where they did not know what was going to happen. And this was an insight that only came to me after the book came out, actually. But I was reflecting on my own practice as a consultant. And one of the things I realized was that the reason why I and my clients did not want to do things which they didn't know how to do was not really because they didn't know how to do the thing. Like, they know how to experiment, they know how to design tests. The reason why they didn't do it was because they were afraid, right? It was a very visceral, emotional reaction to not knowing what success looks like and not knowing how you achieve success. And the insight that came to me was that if you've got an emotional reaction that is not really fact-based, it's not about how difficult it is to come up with a new service model for interacting with customers at a bank or developing a new type of microphone. Those are technical questions that can be solved with rational analysis once you've decided to do it. The main obstacle was that people were afraid that they didn't know what to do and what success meant. And that insight came to me when I looked at how the teams that were very successful did everyday things. What they did every day was they did small things that they didn't know how to do. And the fear that is associated with something small and low stakes that you don't know how to do is obviously much more manageable and much more controllable. It's a hurdle that you can cross over. And once you keep crossing over that hurdle of doing something which makes you a little bit afraid again and again, every time you cross that hurdle and you bring that hurdle up a little bit higher, your ability, your capacity to do something which is uncomfortable in a way that lets you learn keeps on growing. It's the main, see you later, Matt. The main problem with this thinking is that we don't think about giving people the ability to do uncomfortable things the same way we think about lifting weights or doing any kind of resistance training, right? If you are doing any kind of resistance training at all, you know that the first thing you do is not take on the heaviest weights. What you do is you take on something which is fairly light and manageable, but slightly beyond your capacity. And once you are able to do that, you increase the weight, you increase the weight, you increase the weight. It's called progressive loading, and it's a very well-established principle. We know it not only conceptually and empirically, we know it instinctively, but we don't seem to apply it to doing things that make us cognitively uncomfortable. And so that's what IDK is about, right? IDK is about taking the fear of not knowing that affects everything and putting it into contexts that are less threatening so that you get used to doing the thing that you don't know how to do. And you get used to the visceral feeling of fear that you confront when you do that, so that when you confront something that is really fearful and substantive, you are not impeded from doing the thing just because you're afraid that you don't know how it's going to work out. And so that's the sort of the broad genesis. Like, it all came from the book, but it came after the book and in a completely different way. So it's not like these cards get used by these teams. Like, they have never seen these cards actually. But in the last year or so, especially during lockdown and before I made the cards, I started giving my consulting clients exercises that are very similar to what these cards do, to make them do things that make them slightly uncomfortable every day or every week, so that over time they become more comfortable with doing something which makes them naturally averse to doing it. And I got very good results from it. So I decided to make some cards. Okay, anyway, so I've spoken a lot about stuff. Maybe we take a pause, get your reactions.
There's so much going on in that. It's fascinating. The one thing, and I think this is probably just because of something that a client has been sort of like talking about recently, is sort of like there's two alternative forces. Like, so businesses like certainty, and businesses like to be certain that they have some sort of certainty. And I've got a client who have been using OKRs and just sort of like thinking about how do we set a series of objectives and key results that helps us sort of like progress our business. And yet they are a quite interesting startup looking for, and you were talking about it before, sort of like things that sort of like do not exist in the world currently. And so therefore there's no way of knowing exactly how it's going to pan out. And yet they're kind of like trying to hold on to this rudder of OKRs as being sort of like, this will be the thing that takes us to the great unknown. There was a little nod of your head there when you sort of like, you heard the OKR phrase. So it's sort of like, how do the two things clash for you?
I used to work at Google, where OKRs were a huge thing. They used OKRs exclusively for everything from high-level strategy all the way down to very tactical action. And that's actually how OKRs are designed, right? They're supposed to roll up into really grand corporate level strategy and then decompose into the concrete thing that an individual contributor does to achieve all of that stuff. Now, the reason why there was that little nod and the snort, which you didn't hear because I was muted, is because I think this kind of roll up and decompose way of thinking about setting goals and executing on them, it really only makes sense when you've got certainty in several different ways, right? So one of them is you have to know that what you're trying to achieve is actually what you want. You have to know how probable it is that any given action results in that particular outcome. And then I think you also have to be fairly certain that the framework in which value is being created, like the fact that you desire this outcome, will not change. And the problem with any startup, and I'm actually consulting for 2 startups and I'm working on my own startup at the moment, is you know that most startups end up pivoting, right? Because when you go into the idea of building a startup in the first place, your idea of what product market fit is provisional and hypothetical. You don't necessarily know what your product will look like. You also don't understand the market perfectly. And so along the way, as you build and try things out, your idea of the product is evolving. Your idea of the market, your understanding of the market is evolving. The idea of what product market fit you are trying to build is obviously evolving. I think OKRs they're not completely inappropriate, but what they should be restricted to is whatever it is that you have high certainty, you know for sure. And not only do you know for sure that this is the outcome that you want, it should also be something where you're fairly certain that that thing will not change. And really importantly, you should be fairly certain that the way you achieve that desired outcome is quite clear to you. And this is about causation, because we also know, because this is the world that I feel like most of us work in, most actions that we take don't really have very clear singular connections to the outcomes that they produce, right? This is the big problem with causal ambiguity if you're a manager. You do something and you're not sure whether the thing that you did resulted in the outcome that emerged. And the big problem is when you assume that it does, right? So if you're a successful investor and you did X and you achieved a 30X return on your investment, but the next time you do X, you lose everything. Some smart investors realize that the reason why they're successful is luck. Other investors who are not so smart think that they somehow know how to achieve a 30X return and they were just unlucky the time it didn't work. This is exactly the same problem that managers face when they assume that they've got causal certainty, when they don't actually have causal certainty. And so I think OKRs are really, really difficult and they're risky. They're risky in the sense that you know that in most cases, OKRs are not the correct way to set goals. And so what I would say is part 5 of my book talks about how you set goals in situations where you don't know what the goal outcome should be yet. And it's about superordination, right? If you know, for instance, okay, so I'll give an example. When I was at Google early on, so I joined Google in 2005 and I was there for 3 years. And in those early days at Google, they were still really good about having not only OKRs, because it was already entrenched even back then, but they also had, if you recall, the kind of the commandments of Google, right? And the top commandment was don't be evil. And it's at that level of simplicity. And nowadays, of course, I mean, even by 2008, when I left, it was very clear that they were really, really fucking evil by then. But when I joined in 2005, it was still plausible to say, I work at Google and I'm there because we're not evil, and say it with a straight face and actually even believe it, because it was not uniformly true, but you could be in parts of the business that it was more or less true for. But something like that, a very high level superordinate goal that is easy to understand. If you are googly, you know, if you embody Google culture, you could be in Google and you could look at the project and you could say, this is evil, this is not evil, without having to say what the project is in advance. And this is very similar to how, if you recognize, for instance, a particular artist's signature style, like music by Madonna, every single song that she comes out with that's new feels different and yet feels the same. Every product that Apple comes out with is different and sometimes can be the first product of its kind ever, but feels the same. Every painting by Van Gogh is a new painting, but feels the same. what you're really looking for when you're articulating these goals in a situation of uncertainty that a startup faces is, what is the style that characterizes a successful outcome, not what is the concrete thing that characterizes the concrete outcome. And this is something which OKRs find very difficult, because OKRs are all about granularity and concreteness, right? They want you to create what they call SMART goals. And SMART goals only work when you don't have any kind of ambiguity about what the goal is. This is definitionally true about how SMART goals are defined. It just doesn't work very well. So if I were you, I would just tell them, only use OKRs when you know for sure that you are going to try and achieve this thing. For everything else, work at something which is a little bit less concrete, but ends up being more effective.
There's something in what you just described that made me think, and this was years ago, but it's sort of like, and I worked more in kind of sort of like brand and media end of clients then. But I was really interested, instead of having a tone of voice, which is how a sort of like a brand wrote things and so on, etc. It was like, how do you have a tone of action? So it's not necessarily kind of like the same sort of like words or slogans or whatever else, but it just feels like the same group of people doing the same thing. And to your
Yes.
point, it can be a completely different thing in a completely different field, but it feels like that company doing that thing. To bring it back to cards, I'd like to just sort of, let's say there's, because one of the beauties of cards, and I think why a lot of people here use them, is that they have built-in inherent uncertainty. Because you shuffle them and you deal and you go, I don't know which one it's going to be, but here's the one that you've got to do. And there's a sense of people accept the game, because even in the very form of being sort of like 52 cards in a pack, etc. If you turn somebody, if you deal someone 3, they know that that's their 3 because of the culture that comes loaded into the process. It's like, no, well, you can't just sort of like, you don't turn around in poker and change your hand because you don't like it. It's sort of like, those are the, I mean, the phrase is, these are the cards I've been dealt and I will play them.
Yeah.
Is this your first deck of cards when you made these as part of this?
Yeah, so the first thought I had in reaction to what you said, John, is I completely agree. I think one of the really important things about games in general, in practice, and about cards as games used in practice is that there is uncertainty, but it's constrained within a world where the rules are quite well understood if they're well designed, right? And so what this does, my take on it, is what this does is it gives people enough of an anchor that they feel okay embracing the uncertainty that is residual. So I agree about why that's actually why I did these cards. And actually, one of the aspects of the cards and how they work is that a lot of the time when you tell someone you need to embrace uncertainty, like, you know, if you're a consultant and you tell your client you need to embrace uncertainty, they may say, yes, I do, but you know that they don't, right? Because it's an extrinsic motivator to do something which is intrinsically very difficult to do. And one of the principles, so I was trained by a bunch of social psychologists, one of whom had a really interesting insight back in the 60s, that things are more likely to be done that are difficult if they are driven by intrinsic motivators than by extrinsic motivators. And this has since been validated by tons of studies. And so one of the main components of IDK is that it has to be a practice, you know, consciously going out and finding a situation where you are made to be productively uncomfortable, has to be a practice that you decide to take on for yourself, rather than a practice that someone else has told you to take on, right? It's exactly like if your mom tells you when you're 5 years old that you got to learn to play the piano, but you fucking hate playing the piano. Of course, you're going to like pretend to do it. And if you are, unfortunately, the child of a really powerful parent, you may even become good at it, but you will hate it. Whereas if you have a genuine intrinsic love of the thing that you are trying to do that is hard, your entire approach to doing it is completely different. And so I think framing this difficult activity in the context of a game where there is uncertainty that you have to deal with because these are the cards that you've been dealt, but it's within the context of an action or an activity that you have chosen yourself, where the rules and the residual uncertainty can be parameterized and constrained in a way that you're comfortable with, I think is a huge part of why something like this could work. And in fact, has also been part of why it has worked even before it was a game. Because I would never have done this with a client if they didn't come to me and say, okay, you know what, we've been talking about uncertainty for so long, what can I do now to do this in a way that isn't terrifying, right? And at that point, I can give them maybe something like this, right? I mean, not on a card, I would just tell them. But at that point, they're ready for it, where before they wouldn't be ready if I just gave them the instruction and they just did it. It would not have the same effect, even though they would be doing maybe exactly the same action in response to exactly the same prompt.
There's definitely, there's a sense there of sort of like, I've crossed the threshold, I've entered the arena, I am now in the kind of like the rules of that universe, and I will,
Yeah.
I accept that and will play to them.
Yeah.
I'm going to open this up to the floor because obviously we have lots of people with you. Look at Rena. Rena's going already. Come on, Rena. Come on in.
I'm just going to tag Lynette because this is very pertinent to what Lynette's going to reveal.
Lynette, come on.
Sorry, just I'll give it some primer. There's two clients of mine, so one on my own and one with Lynette, a tech startup with a CEO whose main big problem is why aren't my engineers wanting to do what I want them to do, right? And he has these 10 commandments of like, do this, do that, don't do that, and they're not doing it. And then high value lawyers who want to do futures work and have been shown how to do that through workshops, but are still reticent and slightly fearful of like, ooh, I don't know if I'm going to do justice the way that Lynette has competently done in a workshop, and how to cascade that to their own clients. So that's the wider context here of like, why aren't people doing the work, even though they know the process and there's other tools available, but there's something stopping them from practicing.
Yeah, my colleague in a startup that I am starting to run is also on the call, and we know that this happens because we face this. I mean, Henry can chime in about whether or not we literally face this every day, but we do face this every day, right? So we know that what we're trying to get, and ours are lawyers as well working in a technology space. We try and get them to think about doing something which they have never done before, which they know they want to do, and yet they're still unable to take the actions that will allow them to do something which they know is uncertain, because there is a lot of, in some cases, rational fear that it will fail. But I think a large part of it is just fear of doing something which has never been done before, where the criteria of success is not established, where the path to achieving an unknown definition of success has not yet been defined. It's a huge problem. What I would maybe say is maybe something like this could help. Maybe, I don't know. But Lynette, were you going to say something?
It's not, in a sense, if the client is happy to say, listen, this is not a core competence for us. We want to buy this service in, just come in and do it for us all the time, and we'll give you loads of money to do it. It would not break my heart. But speaking more broadly, what I think is encapsulated in what Rena said is that the intuitive difficulty, and Vaughn, when you said that they're not sure what success conditions are, I think that might be part of it. There's an intuitive difficulty in the part of people who practice a profession, like our lawyers, in asking them to do something that does not fall well within the lanes that they are prepared to operate on.
Yeah.
And there are people, many in this room right now, for whom the idea, can you sell a new and innovative product that is really going to rock the world of the person you're talking to? This is a crowd that'll say, yeah, get me in there right away. Whereas a corporate lawyer who's doing reasonably well on $250,000 a year PEP out of their giant law firm might well find themselves saying, well, an hour spent doing that might be an hour spent not moving my well-trodden legal services rate.
100%. I think the real question, and Lynette, so we'll 100% agree that this is exactly what I think is going through people's heads. The main problem is when the client comes to you and says, we know that our business is really stable and profitable, but we want to make sure that we have the next big thing, right? Because this is, I mean, I actually do not subscribe methodologically to Clay Christensen's idea of how the incumbent's lunch gets eaten. I think it does get eaten, but there's a different mechanism by which it happens. But this is what all big companies that are very successful and stable see. And the reason why they're unable to do the thing that will eat their own lunch, right, is because of the fear that you're talking about. Because obviously, if you could be guaranteed that your stable business model will persist forever, then there is no reason to do the new thing that you don't know how to do yet that might replace your stable business model. The problem is what we do know, and all of us in this room know it is because we live in this world, is that the rate of change of business models and business environments is skyrocketing. Like you used to have company tenure in the tens of years, and now average company tenure in any kind of top whatever list, right, is like, if it's even a decade, it's a long time. So as cycle times for stability of a business model go down, you definitionally have to figure out how to replace your business model with something new. And this is what clients come to you to say they want, but what you need to get them over is not the conceptual problem of what it is that we do. You need to get the entire organization, the managers, the individual contributors, the leadership, behind the idea that in order to do the thing that they say they want, they need to do something which is really, really uncomfortable, which is do something they don't know how to do yet. And that's the real challenge. And once you've identified the fear of doing something that you don't know how to do yet as the real problem, you can go straight to that fear. There's none of this bullshit about, let's come up with your strategy plan with all of this cognitive work. That comes later. The big problem is the leader actually afraid of doing something where they don't know the definition of success? Yes. If that's the problem, solve that problem first, is my view, right? Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm going to step away just to make sure that the engineer is doing something. I will be right.
And that was the last we saw of Vaughn after the internet engineer proved to be a serial killer who'd come around his house. The just to sort of to pick up on, I've got so many notes from sort of Vaughn's opening thing. There is a when he was describing the thing of sort of people not knowing. Oh, he's back. Hello, you're back. I was just describing sort of like when you were describing people not knowing they wanted a supercomputer with a large screen and so on. There's a lovely definition of that in Peter Doyle's value-based marketing from decades ago. But he talks about existing in latent and incipient wants. So existing wants are stuff that you can just look around and it's everywhere, and it's usually commoditized, and there might be little feature tweaks that people can go, oh, we can do that too. You've got latent wants, which people can describe. So users can describe to you the things which nobody does yet, but it's kind of obvious to everyone else. So hence the internet was really good for that, for sucking down things through my Starbucks idea or Dell Idea Storm and things like that. But what you described there is like incipient wants. That's the stuff that nobody can tell you that they want it because they don't know it's technologically possible, or the form would be desirable, or it's just like if you ask people in the mid-70s, do you want to walk around listening to music that only you can hear? They'd have gone,
absolutely.
What? I don't know. No, I don't want that.
Yeah.
But there's a sort of, I always think of it sort of like, so existing wants are about foraging. It's just lying on the ground, go around and collect it. Latent wants are about farming. So you just disturb the topsoil a little bit and then you can make things grow. But the incipient wants is like mining, and therefore takes a lot of kind of like hard work to find it. But what you are looking for and you train yourself to look for is almost the geological signs or the environmental signs that says, like, given everything we know so far, there might be something over there because of the lay of the land.
Yeah. And I would add another category of wants, which is the kinds of wants that you get when you discover entirely new terrain, right? Because I think the way we think about what consumers, and consumers can be very broadly defined, the way we think about what consumers want is almost always conditioned by our own prior understanding of the context in which those wants exist. Because all wants are responses to constraints and resources inside or outside. And this is why, so I use science fiction as a really good way of thinking about possible possibilities, right? Where if you relax some set of assumptions about how the world has to work, either in terms of mechanism, or the better science fiction is the kind that relaxes or fundamentally modifies assumptions about social constraints and resources. Like Ursula Le Guin is an amazing example of this. All of a sudden, when you change some of the foundational assumptions that everyone takes for granted, dynamics of interaction, of use of resources, of what products make sense and what's valuable, they change completely. And that's kind of what I mean by, there's all the stuff that's already there, but then what happens when you go to a new world entirely? And we see that actually happening with technology. So it's by Lynette. Well, yes, but I think Chatham House rules. Maybe you release the thing only in audio, who knows? I think what's interesting about where we are now is the reason why the business environment and business models are having such short cycle times of stability is because as technology advances, which is a very hackneyed thing to say, as technology advances, we discover more things that we could want. Some things that we used to want become harder to want or harder to get. But I think the more important thing is our world that we live in and that we do business in is becoming both more technologically complex as well as more interdependent. And when you have situations that are both complex and interdependent, what you have is you've got unpredictability of interactions in an already complex system, right? So as things become more complex and as they become more interdependent, what you get is you get reverberations of perturbation throughout the system, causing more complexity and more uncertainty. You simply cannot predict what the entire system state will look like when there's a perturbation in one area, because the way it ripples out through the system and the way those ripples have effects that then have effects again is less and less predictable to the point where it becomes unpredictable. So I think being able to be sensitive to when you see a new want that was not imaginable or existent before is where we see success coming in the future. And when you look at what is successful in the last year, so I focus a lot on food, so I've been tracking what's been happening with a lot of the new food businesses. A lot of those business models would not really have made sense before COVID. Suddenly with COVID, all of a sudden, it's like you're discovering a new land of possibility in terms of what business models make sense. And so all of a sudden, you've got crazy cross-country delivery business models that now make sense because there's no local consumption anymore, right? And I think this is where, I mean, this is a very circuitous way of coming back to this idea of being okay with not knowing. Because one of the problems that impedes people from seeing new land possibilities is when they're expecting to see something that is already there. And if instead what you're saying is, I don't know what the future will look like, I don't know what success will look like, I'm going to be very, very sensitive to the environment. This is when you notice something which is incipient, not incipient, when you notice something which is just emerging in the environment. It's not even there yet, it's just emerging. And I'll give you a concrete example. Like the other night, I was walking through the forest, like actually this was 2 nights ago. I was walking through the forest at 3 in the morning. It was under this eclipse moon, super bright. And the interesting thing about being in a generally very dark environment is that a lot of the signals that we normally look at in a very bright environment no longer are there. And what we're doing instead is we're really paying very, very close attention to very subtle shadings of light and dark to know whether or not you're going to fall into a big pit, right? And this is exactly what's happening when you are sensitized to not knowing what the future will be, because you will be paying attention to what the future could be in a way that you simply would not be able to do if you had an expectation about what successful outcomes could be and would be. And this is why being able to be productively uncertain, being able to be productively uncomfortable is so important, especially for businesses that are trying to innovate. It is, to me, it's one of the most fundamental things that you have to have in order to be able to innovate continuously.
Rena's had a cracking idea about seeing some cards. So I'm going to get you to hold some of the IDK cards up in a minute. But leaning in, just before we do, leaning into that idea a little, there is, and this is just like picking up a couple of kind of like signals from people describing how they're bringing people back to work. There's a sense that a lot of companies are going to, okay, so the pandemic has thrown us totally. So actually no one's making decisions about what work looks like moving forward, because they're going, no, what we're going to do is we're just going to experiment and let people, we're not going to decide on how much office space we need now. We're just going to run the next 12 months as an experiment to see what people want to do. So suddenly there's almost like a kind of like a global, a global permission to say sort of like, okay, uncertainty is fine because we've gone through so much that continuing that for your shareholders is okay. I mean, let's not go down back to sort of like deliver value to shareholders thing, because that's another argument which could be going for hours. But there seems to be more permission for uncertainty now than there was 18 months ago.
I'm very curious to know if anyone else who's in this session feels the same way. I have a very specific thought about that, actually, but I want to hear from everyone else as well.
Part of uncertainty is switching off mute and seeing what comes out. Come on, people.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me, and I think so. I work a lot in education, and certainly in that field, I think people are kind of sniffing around for where the next thing could be, because it's really been jumbled up, like everything else, about the way that young people are being educated in both lower education and higher education, and yeah, so that makes sense of like sniffing out where the answer is. And I just want to share one more thing that jumped out to me when I looked at one of your cards, was about admitting that you don't know something. And I was a part of a project where we had to admit that we as the teachers didn't know anything. We were just there. It's just like, we're just people who are going to help coach you through it, but we don't know the curriculum, right? We don't know anything. And it was really hard actually inwardly to accept that, even though that was the idea. My assumptions that I carry as a teacher is that you know stuff. And so that really resonates for me, is like to admit that you don't know something is really good. And finally, I feel like if you're all playing the game where we don't know things, then it's easier to admit that. If it's like, there's a game we're playing and we don't know, so let's all play that game. And then it's much easier to do that rather than just like, you have to basically go against the usual identity claim, which as a teacher is, you know, all the stuff that's on the thing. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I'm always struck when teaching that there will always be one request in the class for someone will say, is there a list that I can just read? Have you got a reading list that I can just go and, can I just have the list? Because then I'll just go through systematically through the list of reading things, and then I'll have read it, and then I will be educated, right? It's kind of like whether it's inherent in all education systems or whether it's just like a characteristic of some people, there's always someone who wants that certainty of just show me the path that took us here. Show me the linear progression of just leveling up. Rena, you must find this too.
The teaching.
No, just the students asking for lists and certainty.
There's definitely a matrix of learning modes. So you have the students who I just want the detail. I want fun. I want tasks done. I'm like, I want to chat to people first. So yeah, I mean, all of those four in combination. To the point of like the cards is like a means of something tangible where you know some parts and not know parts. I'm just surprised that Marcus has turned up so I can ask him about him. But so even cards, like I've got a new deck of an Oracle deck, so it's just like new tarot cards. But right, tarot cards is meant to help. What was meant to help people. Like, oh, I don't know that's happening to my life. Can you give me some steer? And then you get this like reading and you don't get the answers, but you have some sense of like, okay, I guess I have some sort of knowledge about what to do with the future. Like, tell me about my future. Am I going to find riches and whatnot? So we see a pattern or a ritual of card decks surviving throughout the centuries, the Rider-Waite cards for creation of new ones, and it's a whole industry and business, and that seems acceptable. But in the boardroom, right, of like, ooh, like post-it notes we'll tolerate because we got used to that. But shuffling cards, maybe it's a poker table, sure, but shuffling cards. So yeah, I wonder if what is the what's that horse called? Trojan horse card deck.
Yes.
That can you like slide into the boardroom table where they actually like pick it up, and whether it's just like high value or I don't know. I'm thinking about Marcus because his image at the moment is like showing card decks, and he has some whole project about hustle cards or pack of cards. If he's there.
Are you there, Marcus? Marcus, are you there?
Hello, I'm here. How are you all?
We're good, thanks, you performer.
I'm 4 hours away from a holiday, everybody. Bloody hell. What a month.
So I'm actually a professional teacher as well, because I still teach at UCL. And I think what Kevin was saying, it resonates very profoundly with me, because there's actually two sources, well, not just two, but there's two big sources of uncertainty going on in education, right? So one of them is in the mode of delivery. We used to have face-to-face delivery for hundreds of years, I mean, thousands of years. And then all of a sudden in the last, I would say, 8 to 10 years, you start to see a move away from face-to-face that was massively catalyzed and accelerated in the last year because of COVID. So there's a delivery model that there is a lot of uncertainty about what that will look like in the future, which is huge. But I think there's also a content question. And that maybe is what students are responding to even more, because what we used to teach them was clearly valuable. They, if you went to university, you would achieve like 30 to 50% higher lifetime income than if you didn't go to university. There was a clear return on investment for education. And now I think it's also unclear whether that's true, right? So I teach at a business school, whatever that means. And frankly, the kind of content that I'm teaching these students, I do not think prepares them well to go into any kind of business that is innovative or entrepreneurial at all, right? And I have friends and relatives who are VCs or who start companies, and they do not want to hire people who go to business school, because people who go to business school are good at being middle managers in big companies, not founders or early employees at small new ones. So I think there's also a source of uncertainty there, in the sense that they are being taught some content that for a long time was presented as being the right thing to learn, but now is becoming very clear is not necessarily the right thing, or becoming even clearer that it's the wrong thing to learn. And so one of the reasons why I came up with the deck is because I've noticed that students are really afraid of being in an educational situation where it's very clear that even the instructor doesn't know the correct answer. And this is what this deck is meant for, right? Because if I'm teaching strategy to people, if I told them that I know what the correct strategy is, I would be lying, and that would be dishonest and wrong. But if I tell them instead that actually nobody knows what the objectively correct strategy is, and strategy is about developing an argument that is convincing to you and to the people you're trying to convince about what you should do, they are like terrified, even though that actually is what good strategy is. Good strategy is coming up with a well-justified argument for what you should do that convinces people to give you the resources to do it. And I think this goes actually indirectly and also directly to Rina's point, which is we've not normalized the use of games like this in corporate boardrooms because we don't think about them as being valuable as part of business education, right? So when business education has not really been about how you deal with uncertainty ever, like it's never been a thing. And so it's not so surprising to me that we have a situation where people don't even recognize the difference between risk and uncertainty, and that they don't know how to deal with uncertainty at all from a cognitive perspective, let alone from an emotional and affective perspective, which is actually the most important level, right? Because if you're afraid of doing something you never even try, if you don't even try, you don't learn how to be good at it. If you're not good at it, you don't go do it more and more. And this is the big problem. Like I think this is one of the reasons why good entrepreneurs tend not to go to business school. Many of them don't even go to school past the absolute minimum. And they've not been corrupted by an educational system that is really not very good at teaching you about the difference between risk and uncertainty, and teaching you how to deal with true uncertainty that is not risk.
That's I've now got two directions I want to go in from that. And one is, well, I'll tell you what, let's try and do it. We've got 10 minutes. And we're going to do them both. I'm going to say to Marcus, just before we come to Henrik's point in the chat down below, but on that, because the stuff you've been doing, Marcus, around, and this goes back to the education point, around delivery. So suddenly the sort of like the way that you deliver what you deliver has fundamentally changed, and there is as much, if not more, uncertainty about sort of like what big conferences experiences look like moving forward. And I know you have views on this. So how's the uncertainty for you?
I don't know. I'd lie if I. It would be a lie if I said that I didn't care. At the beginning, I was absolutely terrified. I was shitting myself. We can swear in this, can't we? Yeah, good. I was shitting myself last year in April, May, terrified. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, why is that? And then it was just because I worked out that I was just being lazy, really. That I knew exactly, the whole thing was I knew how to do a thing. So I knew how to, and I'd had this whole process of how to build a disruptive performance that would freak everybody out at a business conference. Easy. Could write one in about an afternoon. No problem. Dystopia, super easy. Sit down, go through the process, produce this well-crafted thing, practice it, turn up at a conference, talk to the tech guys, have a script and all of the things, go on stage, do it, and have all the lights and the tech, and all I'd have to do is just perform the thing, write an invoice, job done. Now I'm the executive producer. I'm the lighting guy. I'm the audio guy. I have to do the stage. I have to do the promotion around everything I'm doing as well. And it's a different context too. It's on a screen. So that was the uncertainty bit, was the bit that pushed me on. I didn't go to business school. I was fortunate enough to go to art school. Art schools are better than the business schools. Simple as that.
I would love to do an art school.
Yeah.
Here, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's very cool.
Don't go to business school. Why would you want to go to business school?
That's what I tell my students.
You'll never learn about uncertainty and fear and hunger and poverty if you do an MBA. You will if you learn how to paint pictures. So I basically had all the tools for those things, and I just went. I did a talk. A virtual talk, a pre-recorded thing, where I said it took me 7 years to get to stage 1 at this big conference in Germany. And it felt like something had been taken away from me. That was like, I did all that work and I finally got there, and I was planning another big one, and then the pandemic came, poor old me. But what's actually happened is that by playing around with all of these ideas, all of the tech, I've actually moved out of my work from home, and I'm renting a studio now. So my business has grown. My artwork has grown. I'm producing the best work of my life right now because, I thought, well, okay, what we're going to do now is I can't just sit at home and mope about what I used to do. Let's turn it into something special. So the studio isn't only the studio, it's actually the set for my latest piece. So it's decorated as the studio. It's decorated as the work from whole studio of the main character in my latest piece. So that's how I did it. I just turned it on its head and thought, okay, well, we'll do it like that. And my whole thing about cards, I think, is pretty much well known to the group of people here. So the character in my piece is called Joseph Blasphemous. He's a business magician. Business Magic is a strain of consultancy that he himself invented, and he is the only one who does it, and he's the best at it. And he does card readings, and the cards are blank, but only if you don't believe. And if you truly believe in what Joseph Blasphemous says, then you can see what's on the cards. And that, my friends, is true consultancy. And you don't learn that at business school. You learn that at college, art college. So.
Yes. One of the interesting things about about art. One of my research areas is in innovation in art practice as well. And one of the interesting things about great artists is that periodically they throw out all of their knowledge about a particular medium so that they are forced to learn something new, right? So this is quite consistent with...
Have you just called me a great artist? I think you're my new best friend. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
I'll edit that down, Marcus, and just I'll edit just that bit.
Yeah, but I think it's very consistent with what we've seen not only in art, but also in a lot of other domains, where when you find something really cool and new is when you throw away all your skills in one existing area and force yourself to learn something new in a different area, right? So, if I think about chefs, the chefs who get really interesting are the ones who have been cooking in one tradition for 15 years and then are forced to go into a different culinary tradition where they have to learn everything from the ground up, what the ingredients look like, how you use them, what methods look like, the way they're combined. And in that process, because they're now sensitized, it's just like walking through a forest at night. You are now looking at different things and you're able to pay attention to different things and use them in different ways than if you were just doing the same old thing again and again. And I think that's what Marcus, that certainly seems to me like what Marcus was describing, from having an existing way of doing business be torn away from you. That just forces you to do something different, right? That maybe works and maybe doesn't work. And if you spend all your time bemoaning the fact that you have had your existing business model torn away from you and you don't try something new, you can never do anything new. But if you do try something new, then maybe something cool happens as a result.
There was a phrase that Marcus said, and just that buries into that. So I'm now doing the best work of my life. And back to Henrik's point about large business transformations, and maybe Henrik will invite you to talk here, but when was the last time anyone heard of a large business transformation that invited people to do the best work of their life?
That's a great point.
Well, I think this is one of the advantages of the whole canon of kind of art and art education as well. Specifically, art education is you learn about the suffering, you learn about syphilis and alcoholism and loneliness and poverty and sadomasochism. If you're a painter, you get into Francis Bacon and then you dive into his whole thing. Jackson Pollock and his mental demons, or Rothko. I mean, if you walk into the Rothko room in the Tate, you just get that sense of what it does to you. So I think we interested in what Rena would have to say about this, because she's been working with young, new, fresh students. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, when I was studying art, it was Thatcher's Britain, so we were kind of embraced the misery of arts and cultures at the time. So when something like a pandemic comes along, it's kind of like, oh, that as well. Oh, okay, here we go again. So it's I think for the arts community, it's not as disruptive in a way as it might be for kind of the corporate world. Obviously, anything that involves live events is, they've been devastated by this. But for the arts community as a whole, encapsulating everything that's going on, drama is part of what we do.
I'm going to synthesize these like arts and business together. I know for a fact that the island of Jersey at the moment is trying to scramble a legitimate policy on what to do with arts, culture, and sports. Inside a friend who works for the minister there. And they're a little bit stuck because arts has been seen as a nice to have and something that they can give free money to, or grants and funds. But the opportunity now post-COVID is to, I don't know, with hustleology, bravery, to say art is business and here's how. and the shuffling, I guess, of those like opportunity cards, referring to the Monopoly game, of course. And what I've been doing with teaching the students early on is, in order to get them to see, say, card play as a means of being familiar with the chance factor, or kind of anticipating a set that they want to do, is to first talk about life, histories, contexts as a board game. So the board game mentality is like, right, the game of life is we have people as players, prize, problems, places, so the components of life stuff. And by making them see that, to then slowly, phase by phase, teach them how to see and then how to play their resources as 18 to 20-year-olds, plus new resources that they're learning. Yeah, so I think I'd love to kind of link up with Vaughn and then, I don't know, try and like fuse some stuff to kind of just like eventually get a deck on the board table, along with a nice kind of fruit tray. Because like once upon a time, bananas were foreign, but now they're going to readily accepted. It's like, oh yeah, it's part of the boardroom kit, but really not cards.
Yeah.
So soon.
Cool. John, I think we're at time. I'm not sure how you are.
We're at the top of the hour. I was just about to come in. I would like to say, well, thank you very much, Vaughn, for introducing us to the kind of the ideas behind IDK. We will, if you want to drop a web thing into a web address into the chat where people can find out more. I will. No, we have been recording this. This is the first recorded Cardstock, so I will be blackmailing you all at some point in the future. And although seriously, what I'll do is I'll save it down and I'll send it out and see if everybody's happy with it being uploaded somewhere. And beyond that, thank you very much for coming as always. What have we got planned next month, Rena? Nothing is the answer. Nothing yet.
All right, I could consult my deck and see what the card says.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So that is a perfect way to earn to land. So.
What is? Yeah, this is new. It's nice.
While Rena's doing that, I would love if any of you can think of ways to use IDK that are interesting that I've not talked about. Please let me know. I'll just put in my email address in there as well.
I think partly it's just like we're curious to find out what your card deck says. So I'll be beeping you afterwards and thinking, when do you want to meet up for COVID safe coffee?
I would have put some under the camera, but my pack are somewhere lost in the post thanks to Brexit Customs. Thanks, Brexit Customs.
It's ridiculous. Did you not get the second deck that I sent you, John?
No.
Great. Okay, well.
Yeah, so what happens at next card guard? Look at that. It's like nice.
Yeah, what happens at the next one, Rena? What happens at the next one?
This is new. I don't even know what I'm going to pick up. Whatever that is.
I thought so.
Hay fever and summer, maybe.
It's a dog rose, isn't it?
It's a dog.
Is it a dog rose?
And
I think so.
The rose hip. Rose hip. Yeah.
And
cool.
and the helmet of Hermes.
Hermes, that is a good card.
Is that basically just telling me that? Is that just telling me that Hermes are delivering this pack of cards from Vaughn?
Possibly.
If only.
Now you see why Joseph's cards are blank.
Or now I see what's on them.
You truly believe.
I just love that your eyes, Nick, recognize the flower. That's why I got this deck, so I can learn what each card is in terms of flowers or nature. It just happens to be a tarot card deck.
Well,
cool.
I look forward to welcoming you all to next month's flower stock, in which cards will be a sort of a shoved aside component. Thank you, everyone. Have a brilliant.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Looking forward to the next one. See you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Bye.